The sun had barely set as Jason sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bank statement in front of him. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, but it did nothing to drown out the tension that hung thick in the air. His mother, Clara, was sitting across from him, a stern expression painted across her face as she tapped her fingers impatiently against the wooden table. "Your sister sent us $10,000 this month," she said, her voice dripping with disapproval. "Why can't you be more like her?" Jason's stomach twisted into a knot, but he didn't say anything. He had heard this before. His sister Jessica was always the golden child. The one who made the right choices, went to the best schools, landed a high-paying job, and most importantly, never failed to meet their expectations. Jessica could do no wrong in their eyes, while Jason could barely get a word of praise, no matter how hard he tried. "Jessica doesn't have to deal with the same struggles I do, Mom," Jason finally said, his voice strained. "I've been trying to save up to pay off my student loans and—" "Don't make excuses, Jason," Clara cut him off, her voice sharp. "Your sister didn't make excuses. She made sure we were taken care of, and all we're asking for is a little help." Jason clenched his jaw. His mother's words stung, but he tried to hold it together. He had always tried to support her, tried to make her proud, but nothing he did seemed to be enough. She always compared him to Jessica, and he had learned to brace himself for it. "But I'm not Jessica," Jason said quietly, hoping she would hear the hurt in his voice. "I don't make 6 figures. I'm not living in a fancy condo in the city. I'm just trying to get by." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Well, maybe if you didn't waste so much time with that small-time job of yours, you could be more like your sister. She's successful, Jason. She's taking care of us." "What are you doing?" Jason felt his chest tighten. Her words were like daggers, each one puncturing a small piece of his self-worth. The job he had wasn't glamorous, but it was all he had right now. He had chosen a career path that made him happy, a career that wasn't about the money but about helping people, but that didn't seem to matter to his mother. She only saw dollar signs. "Mom, I can't just send you money like Jessica does," Jason said, trying to explain. "I'm working hard to pay off my debts and build a future. I don't have extra funds to just give away." Before Clara could respond, Jason's father, Greg, entered the room. His heavy footsteps echoed through the house, and for a moment, Jason felt a small sense of relief. Maybe Dad would understand. Maybe he would step in and calm things down. But Greg didn't say anything. He simply walked over to the counter, grabbed a glass of water, and took a seat at the table without acknowledging the tension in the room. His silence made Jason feel smaller. It was as though he was invisible, or worse, irrelevant. Clara turned to Greg, exasperated. "Did you hear this? He's making excuses again." Greg glanced at Jason for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Don't argue with your mother, Jason. She's right. Your sister is doing what needs to be done. You're not going to get anywhere if you don't start pulling your weight around here." Jason's heart sank. His father, who had always been his quiet support, had just sided with his mother. He felt the weight of the words crush him. His own family, the people who should be his safe place, were now his harshest critics. For a brief moment, Jason thought about leaving, about walking out and never coming back. But he stayed, frozen in his seat, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. He had always felt like he was walking in the shadows of his sister's success, but now, it seemed like even his own parents didn't see him for who he truly was. "I'm doing my best," Jason said softly, more to himself than to them. "But it's never enough, is it?" Clara didn't answer. She just shook her head in disappointment and stood up from the table. Greg, too, got up without a word, leaving Jason alone with his thoughts. The silence that followed felt deafening. Jason stared at the bank statement again, the numbers blurring in front of his eyes. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting to prove his worth to them, to make them see that he was capable of more than just the comparison to his sister. But for now, all he could do was hold on. hold on and hope that one day they might understand. The days that followed felt like a blur. Jason couldn't escape the sting of his mother's words or the heavy silence that loomed over the house. Every time he tried to speak, it felt like he was walking into a storm, only to be shut down again. It was Thursday evening when it happened again. Jason had just gotten home from his late shift at the clinic. His feet aching and his mind exhausted. He'd been working long hours, doing everything he could to keep the bills paid and maintain a semblance of normalcy. But tonight, as he walked through the door, he knew his mother would be waiting. Sure enough, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a pile of bills. The look on her face was one of frustration. Her brow furrowed as she searched through the papers with growing agitation. Jason took a deep breath and tried to avoid eye contact, but she wasn't having any of it. "There you are," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence. "I've been waiting for you." Jason froze. "What's wrong?" Clara didn't look up from the papers as she spoke. "You've had plenty of time to figure this out. You're still not sending anything, Jason. Do you even care?" Jason's heart raced. He knew this conversation was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. He set his bag down on the chair beside him, taking a seat across from his mother. "I'm trying, Mom," he said quietly. His voice strained from the weight of the argument he could already feel brewing. "I've explained this 100 times. I don't have the kind of money you're asking for." Clara finally looked up, her eyes cold and hard. "Well, your sister doesn't have an issue with it, does she? She's managing just fine. Why can't you be more like her?" Jason felt a lump form in his throat. The comparison again. Always the comparison. It was like a knife lodged in his chest, and every time they brought Jessica into the conversation, it twisted deeper. "I'm not her," Jason said, his voice wavering as he tried to keep his frustration in check. "I'm doing the best I can. But I'm not going to bankrupt myself to make up for what she's doing." Clara's face hardened, her expression turning to one of anger. "It's not about the money, Jason. It's about showing that you care. Your sister is showing she cares. Why can't you?" Jason couldn't hold it in anymore. His voice cracked as he spoke, the pain of being constantly compared to Jessica spilling out. "Because I'm not her, Mom. I can't just hand you money every time you ask. I'm working hard, but I'm not rich. I don't have what she has. Why can't you see that?" Clara stood up, her face flushed with frustration. "Don't talk back to me, Jason. I'm your mother. I'm the one who's always taken care of you. And all I ask is for a little help. A little respect." Jason stood up too, his fists clenched at his sides, struggling to keep his anger in check. He felt like he was suffocating under her expectations, under the weight of constantly having to defend himself. "I'm not asking for your approval," Jason snapped, his tone sharp. "I'm not asking you to compare me to Jessica. I'm asking you to see me for who I am. I'm not a failure just because I don't have the money to send." Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment, Jason thought he might have reached her. But then his father, Greg, entered the room. His presence a silent reminder of how disconnected Jason had become from both of them. Jason had hoped for a reprieve, maybe some understanding from his father. But instead, Greg simply glanced at him, his expression neutral. "Jason, you know your mother's just trying to make sure the bills get paid. You can't keep avoiding your responsibilities." Jason felt the words hit him like a slap to the face. He turned to his father, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm not avoiding anything. I'm just not her. Why can't you both understand that?" Greg didn't respond. He just stood there, his arms crossed, watching as Jason's frustration boiled over. Jason took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down, but it felt impossible. The weight of the argument, of always being seen as less than Jessica, was suffocating him. He turned to leave, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm not going to keep doing this," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper as he walked away from the kitchen. "I'm done." As he made his way to his room, he could hear his mother's voice rise in anger behind him, But he didn't turn back. He couldn't. The constant pressure, the constant comparison, had become too much to bear. And for the first time in his life, Jason didn't feel like he owed them anything. He slammed the door behind him and sat on the edge of his bed, his hands shaking. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about everything. His worth, his place in the family. His ability to be seen as something more than just the failure who couldn't live up to Jessica's success. Jason stared out of the window, the city lights flickering below. He wasn't sure where he would go from here. But one thing was certain. He couldn't keep living for their approval. It was time for him to stand up for himself, to stop being the person they wanted him to be, and to start figuring out who he truly was. Jason couldn't sleep. It had been 2 days since the blow-up with his mother, and the events kept replaying in his mind like an endless loop. Each time he closed his eyes, he could still hear her words, her disappointment, feel the weight of her judgment. The silence in the house seemed even louder now, echoing the distance that had grown between him and his family. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at the wall. The soft glow of his laptop screen was the only light in the room. For the 100th time, he opened the folder on his desktop labeled Family. Inside were old photos, snapshots of happier times, times when things had seemed more simple, when he was still just a kid, still believing that family meant unconditional love. He clicked on the first photo, an old family portrait from when Jason was about 10 years old. His parents were smiling, Jessica was beaming beside him, and he could almost feel the warmth of their embrace. He had been so young then, unaware of the growing rift between him and his sister. The subtle favoritism that was always there, always hovering in the background, but never really spoken about. Back then, Jason had believed it was just part of growing up, being compared to Jessica. She was always the perfect child. She excelled in school, was outgoing and popular, and was always ready to lend a hand to anyone in need. And he was the quieter one, the one who preferred solitude over the chaos of social gatherings. He never liked playing the part of the perfect son, always feeling like something was missing in his own life. As he scrolled through more pictures, Jason saw the contrast between the love and pride his parents showered on Jessica and the indifference they often showed him. He had always been good enough, but never more than that. In their eyes, he wasn't the shining star. Jessica was. And he could never shake the feeling that he was living in her shadow. "Why do I keep trying?" Jason muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. He thought back to his childhood, to the many moments when his parents had pushed him toward something he wasn't sure he wanted. His father, Greg, had always been practical, telling Jason to follow the traditional path, get a stable job and be a provider. His mother, Clara, was more emotional, but her pressure to succeed in ways that pleased her was no less overwhelming. In high school, Jason had wanted to be a writer. He had a passion for storytelling, for creating worlds in his mind. But his parents had never seen it as something worthwhile. "Writing won't pay the bills," his father had told him. "Find a real career, Jason." So Jason had let go of that dream, pushing it aside for the sake of their approval. He chose something practical, nursing. It wasn't his first love, but it was steady work. Helping people was something he could be proud of. And yet, even in that, he couldn't escape the feeling that he wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for his parents. He wasn't climbing the corporate ladder like Jessica. He wasn't making headlines or raking in money. So, to them, he was just another cog in the machine. Jason leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The weight of it all was suffocating. He had spent so much of his life trying to live up to their expectations, trying to be the son they wanted, the one who could prove himself worthy of their love. But no matter how hard he tried, he was always second place to Jessica. And no matter how many times he told himself he was happy with his own choices, the doubt crept in like a shadow he couldn't shake. "Maybe they're right," he whispered, the thought lingering in his mind. "Maybe I'm just not good enough." Jason wasn't sure how long he sat there, lost in his thoughts. But eventually, something shifted within him. The sadness, the anger, it was all consuming him. But in that moment, he realized that he couldn't keep allowing himself to be defined by their perceptions of him. He had been living for their approval, but he was exhausted. Exhausted from pretending to be someone he wasn't. Exhausted from fighting a battle that he couldn't win. And even more than that, he was tired of comparing himself to Jessica. He didn't have to be like her to be worthwhile. He was his own person and he deserved to live his own life. Jason stood up abruptly, feeling a surge of determination pulse through him. He walked over to the small mirror on the wall and looked at his reflection. His eyes were tired, but they were clear. For the first time in a long while, he saw something other than doubt and insecurity. He saw someone who had been struggling, yes, but someone who was capable of more than he realized. Someone who could stand up for himself, even if it meant going against the tide. Enough, Jason muttered to himself. Enough of this. He walked over to his desk and opened a blank document on his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, but then, without hesitation, he began to type. Not for his parents, not for anyone else, just for himself. He started writing about his feelings, about the hurt, the confusion, the constant battle with his own worth. It was raw, unfiltered, but it felt like a release. He didn't know if it would turn into something he could use one day, but for the first time it didn't matter. It felt good to write something for himself. As he typed, a small part of him began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he had thought. That his worth didn't depend on meeting anyone else's expectations. That he had something valuable to offer, even if his parents couldn't see it. And as the words flowed onto the screen, Jason made a vow to himself. He was done seeking their approval. It was time to define his own path, to stop comparing himself to Jessica, and to start living life on his own terms. The weeks that followed were a blur of introspection and quiet determination. Jason had made a choice. He wasn't going to let his parents' disappointment or his sister's success define him anymore. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The constant comparisons, the pressure to live up to an idealized version of himself. He was done with it. But as he moved through each day, a new realization began to settle in. Jason had spent so much of his life waiting for validation from his family, from his parents, that he hadn't even stopped to ask himself what he truly wanted. What was his purpose? What did he want out of life beyond just trying to prove something to others? He sat in his small apartment one Saturday afternoon, the sun casting a warm glow through the window as he absent-mindedly flipped through his notes for work. It was a quiet moment, a rare break in the whirlwind of his everyday responsibilities, but it was enough for him to pause and reflect. A voice in his head, one he had been avoiding for years, whispered softly, "What if you could do something more? Something that was just for you?" Jason set the stack of papers down and leaned back in his chair, letting the thought linger. He had always assumed that he had to follow a straight path. Nursing had been a practical choice, one that made sense at the time, but now he wondered if it was really what he wanted to do long-term. He wasn't unhappy with his job, but it didn't ignite a passion in him the way his childhood love for storytelling had. He had abandoned his dream of being a writer a long time ago, but the desire had never truly gone away. It sat there quietly in the back of his mind, waiting for him to realize that he didn't have to be bound by the expectations of his parents or the limits of his current situation. Jason stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. It was a busy Saturday, the streets crowded with people going about their lives, and yet, here he was, standing still, caught in the whirlwind of his own thoughts. Was this it? He wondered. Was this all there was to my life? The answer, surprisingly, was no. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He didn't want to be stuck in a cycle of playing it safe, of choosing stability over happiness. He wanted more. He wanted to live for himself, not for his parents' approval. It was terrifying to think about pursuing a dream that had been buried for so long. But for the first time, Jason realized that he couldn't keep living in a state of fear. Fear of failure, fear of disappointing others, fear of not being enough. He had to face those fears head-on. Jason turned away from the window and walked to his desk. He pulled out his notebook, the one that had been collecting dust for years, and opened it to a blank page. The words flowed out as he started to write again, not for anyone else but for himself. His ideas, his stories, the characters he had imagined over the years. Everything that had once felt impossible was now within his reach. He realized then that it wasn't about the money, the job, or the approval. It was about pursuing something that made him feel alive, something that would challenge him and help him grow. Writing was more than just a dream. It was a part of him that he had neglected for far too long. That evening, Jason made another decision. He was going to take a leap of faith. He wasn't sure how he was going to make it work, but he knew he had to try. He would start writing again, seriously this time. He would carve out time every day, even if it meant sacrificing other things, to pursue his passion. And as he thought about his parents, who had always pushed him toward a more practical path, he knew it was time to stop waiting for their approval. They might never understand why he wanted to follow this dream, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Jason was finally choosing himself. He wasn't going to be the person they wanted him to be. He was going to be the person he had always been inside. The person who had dreams, who had the courage to take risks, who wasn't afraid to break free from the mold. He spent the next few weeks putting his plan into action. He carved out time in the mornings before work to write, no matter how tired he was, and slowly but surely, the words began to flow. His stories began to take shape, and for the first time in years, he felt excited about the future. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt, moments when the old voices of self-doubt crept in, telling him he wasn't good enough. He would look at his stories and question whether they were worth anything. He would wonder if his family would ever see him as successful without the career they had always dreamed for him. But as he continued to write, he realized something important. Success wasn't about what anyone else thought. It was about what he thought of himself. And for the first time in his life, Jason felt like he was on the path to becoming the person he was always meant to be. Someone who followed his heart, even when it was scary, even when it was uncertain. He wasn't just living for the approval of others anymore. He was living for himself. Jason's life had taken a new turn. Every day felt like a small victory as he made time for his writing, slowly carving out space for his dreams. But even as he embraced this new version of himself, he knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be smooth. Old habits, old expectations were hard to shake off, and the pressure from his family continued to weigh on him. It was a Friday afternoon when he received a message from Jessica. The text was brief, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. "Mom and Dad are talking about you again. They think you've lost your way. Are you okay?" Jason stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He hadn't heard from Jessica in weeks. Their relationship had always been distant, partly because of the constant comparisons, partly because of the life paths they had chosen. But now, as the message lingered on the screen, Jason could feel the weight of his parents' judgment once again pressing down on him. "Why are they always looking at me like I'm the one who's wrong?" he thought, his chest tightening. He had made peace with the idea that he would never live up to their expectations, but it still hurt to know that they were still talking about him, still measuring his worth against Jessica's achievements. He took a deep breath and typed back, "I'm fine. Just doing things my way now." A few seconds passed before Jessica replied, "Are you sure? Mom's really worried. She doesn't understand why you won't help out more. You know how they are." Jason's fingers gripped the phone tighter. He could feel the old resentment bubbling up again. The way his parents had always tried to make him feel like less. They had always pushed him aside, always assumed that he wasn't capable of the success that Jessica had achieved. The thought of continuing to play by their rules, to give in to their demands just to make them happy, filled him with anger. He wasn't sure how to respond, so he put his phone down and paced the room. The temptation to call his parents, to apologize, to beg for their approval, was still there. But he knew that if he did that, he would be betraying everything he had fought for, the courage to define his own life, to live for himself. Instead of replying to Jessica, Jason decided to focus on something that gave him peace. He picked up his notebook, opened it to a blank page, and began writing. The words came easily this time, flowing faster than ever before, as though they had been waiting for him to unlock the door. As he wrote, his phone buzzed again. It was his mother. "Jason, we need to talk. Please call when you can. You know we're only trying to help." He stared at the message for a long time. His heart was torn. On one hand, he felt like he had the responsibility to tell them how he felt, to explain his choices, to make them understand. On the other hand, he was terrified that if he did, he would be pulled back into their world of expectations, forced to abandon his dreams just to keep the peace. The truth was, Jason didn't know if he had it in him to go back to that life. The life of constantly pleasing everyone but himself. The life where he was a pawn in his family's narrative, always striving to be something he wasn't. He couldn't go back to that. Not now. Still, a small part of him wanted to. That part that craved validation. The part that felt like a failure for not living up to their ideal of who he should be. The part that wondered if they were right, if maybe he was making a mistake, choosing a path that was too risky, too uncertain. Jason sat back in his chair and closed his eyes, trying to clear his mind. He thought about the stories he had been writing, about the way they made him feel, alive, passionate, connected to something bigger than himself. And in that moment, he realized that the only approval he needed was his own. He grabbed his phone and typed a message back to his mother. "I'm living my life now, Mom. I know you want what's best for me, but I need to do this on my terms. Please try to understand." He pressed send before he could second-guess himself, and as the message disappeared into the ether, Jason felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't sure how his parents would respond, but he knew he had made the right choice. For the first time in years, he was living for himself, not for anyone else. Later that evening, the phone rang. Jason saw his mother's name on the screen. His heart raced as he picked it up, unsure of what to expect. "Jason." His mother's voice came through, strained and emotional. "We're just concerned about you. You're pushing us away, and I don't know what to do. We want to help, but we don't know how." Jason took a deep breath. He could hear the sadness in her voice, the fear that he was slipping away from her. It was hard to hear, but he knew this moment was necessary. He had to set boundaries, to stand firm in his decision. "Mom, I understand that you're concerned, but I need you to respect my choices. I'm not abandoning you or rejecting you. I'm just choosing to live for myself." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Jason thought she might hang up. But then her voice softened. "I just want you to be happy, Jason. I want you to be okay." Jason's throat tightened. "I will be, Mom. Promise. I just need you to trust me." And for the first time in a long time, he heard a shift in his mother's tone, a small crack in the armor of her worry. It wasn't complete understanding, but it was something. And for Jason that was enough. As he ended the call, he realized that the battle wasn't over. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges, with resistance from his family and doubts from within. But he had made it through this moment. He had stood up for himself and chosen his own path. And that, he realized, was the only way forward. Jason thought the hardest part was over. He had taken the first step, setting boundaries with his parents and starting to embrace his writing. But he quickly realized that the road to self-discovery wasn't a straight line. It was full of detours, obstacles, and moments of doubt. The following week, his parents continued to call, but each conversation felt like a tug of war. His mother would express her concern. His father would try to convince him to come back to his sensible career, and Jason would do his best to hold firm, to explain that this was his choice, his path, and that he wasn't looking for their approval anymore. But no matter how hard he tried to explain, he could feel the judgment in their words, the unspoken belief that he was making a mistake. And then there was Jessica. She called him one evening after their parents had tried to convince her to intervene. "Jason, can we talk?" she asked, her voice distant. It was the first time she had called him in weeks, and the coldness in her tone made him wary. He braced himself for the familiar guilt trip. "Sure, what's up?" Jason replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. I don't get it, Jason. Why are you doing this? Why are you throwing everything away?" Jessica's words were sharp, but underneath them, Jason could hear the frustration in her voice. "I'm not throwing everything away. I'm choosing something for myself," Jason said, trying to remain calm. He could feel the familiar tension building between them, the divide that had always existed. "I know you're upset with Mom and Dad," Jessica continued, "but they're just trying to help you. They want the best for you, you know that, right?" Jason closed his eyes, rubbing his forehead. "I'm not upset with them, Jess. I'm tired of trying to live up to their expectations. I want to do something that makes me happy. Something that's mine." "But you're a nurse, Jason. That's a good job. You're good at it. You're helping people. Why risk everything for something that might not even work out?" Jason felt the frustration rising in his chest. It wasn't the first time he had heard this argument, and it wouldn't be the last. His sister had always been the one to toe the line, the one who followed the safe path, the one who did everything by the book. But Jason didn't want to be Jessica. He didn't want to live in the shadow of someone else's version of success. "I'm not like you, Jess," Jason said, his voice finally cracking. "I don't want the same life you have. I don't want to just fall in line and do what's expected of me. I want more than that." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Jason thought she might hang up. But then Jessica sighed heavily. "I just want you to be happy, Jason. But you're making this so much harder than it needs to be. Mom and Dad, they're worried about you. And so am I." Jason felt a pang in his chest, the weight of his sister's words landing heavier than he expected. He knew she was coming from a place of love, but her version of love felt suffocating. It was as if she couldn't see that what he was doing wasn't about rejecting them. It was about finding himself. "I know you care, Jess. But I have to do this. For me." The call ended soon after that, and as Jason put his phone down, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief because he had finally stood up for himself. And guilt because he knew he had just made a crack in his relationship with his sister, the one person who had always been there for him, even if they had never seen eye to eye. Over the next few days, the tension between him and his family only grew. His parents sent him more texts, more calls, all filled with concern, with attempts to talk him out of his decisions. Jessica sent messages too, trying to convince him to reconsider, to go back to nursing, to choose a life that was safe. But Jason was resolute. He had made his choice, and he wasn't going to back down. Every time his phone rang, every time he read a message, he could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. But with each passing day, the feeling of uncertainty grew smaller. He was becoming more confident in his decisions, more certain of the path he was on. At work, things were no different. His colleagues had noticed that he seemed distracted, that he wasn't the same Jason who had once been eager to help everyone, who had stayed late to pick up extra shifts. He was still a good nurse, still dedicated to his patients, but his heart wasn't fully in it anymore. One evening, his supervisor, Karen, pulled him aside. "Jason, is everything okay? You've been distant lately," Karen said, her concern genuine. Jason hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to get into the details of his personal life, but something about Karen's kindness made him feel like he could open up, even just a little. "I'm fine," Jason said, forcing a smile. "Just working through some stuff. You know you can talk to me if you ever need to, right? We all go through difficult times." Jason nodded, grateful for her support. "Thanks, Karen. I appreciate it." But even as he smiled and reassured her, a voice in the back of his mind kept questioning whether he was really fine. Was he making the right decision? Was he throwing away his stability, his career, for something that might never work out? As much as he tried to push those doubts aside, they lingered, hovering over him like a storm cloud, threatening to burst at any moment. The next few days were a blur of emotions. His parents' continued pressure, Jessica's silent treatment, and his own doubts creeping in every time he sat down to write. But despite everything, Jason kept moving forward. He wrote in the mornings before work. He took small steps toward building his writing career, and he kept reminding himself that this was his journey, not theirs. One night, after another heated exchange with his mother, Jason found himself standing by his window again, staring out at the city lights. The weight of it all was heavy, but as he watched the world below, he realized something. He was on the brink of something. Turning point. And no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much his family resisted, he had to keep pushing forward. For himself. For the person he was becoming. The days felt longer now. Every time Jason picked up his phone, there was another message, another call, another reminder from his family of the life they had planned for him. His parents, relentless in their attempts to steer him back onto the right path, were still convinced that he was throwing his future away. His mother continued to express her concern with long, tearful messages, and his father, ever the stoic, practical one, sent him occasional reminders of the career opportunities he could easily slide back into if he just let go of these delusions. Even Jessica, despite the brief moments of support, had grown distant, the strain between them too thick to ignore. The pressure was wearing him down. Jason found himself walking through his days in a fog, his heart heavy with the weight of the expectations from every corner of his life. It was as if he was drowning, surrounded by voices, opinions, and fears, but unable to breathe under the weight of them all. Writing, the thing that had once sparked joy in him, now felt like a chore. The pages were harder to fill. The characters didn't come to life the way they used to, and his stories felt forced, like he was trying to pull words from a well that had run dry. No matter how much time he spent sitting at his desk, no matter how hard he tried to push through the mental blocks, the magic was slipping away. One particularly difficult night, after a long shift at the hospital, Jason sat at his kitchen table, his head in his hands. The phone had rung again, another voicemail from his mother, another plea for him to come to his senses. He hadn't been able to bring himself to listen to it, and now he felt utterly defeated. The weight of the world was on his shoulders, and every decision, every choice he had made in the past few months seemed to be crumbling around him. What if they were right? What if he was making a huge mistake? His mind was racing, his anxiety growing with every passing second. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor, and paced around the apartment. The tightness in his chest was unbearable now. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to scream, cry, or run away from everything. He thought about the life his parents had envisioned for him, the stable career, the predictable path, the comfort of never having to worry about whether you made the right decision. It was safe. It was easy. And it was so damn hard to walk away from. Jason slammed his fist against the counter in frustration. Why was it so hard to choose himself? Why couldn't he just forget the guilt, the disappointment, and follow his heart? His phone buzzed again. It was a text from Jessica. Mom's asking again. She said if you don't call her soon, she'll come over. Are you sure this is worth it? Jason stared at the text, the familiar ache spreading through his chest. His sister wasn't even angry anymore. She wasn't trying to fight him. She was just tired. She was tired of trying to understand, tired of watching their family fall apart over something that seemed so insignificant to her. Maybe I am making a mistake, Jason thought. Maybe I should just give in. Maybe if I just went back to nursing, everything would go back to normal. But even as he entertained the thought, he knew it wasn't true. Going back wasn't an option anymore. He couldn't keep pretending to be someone he wasn't. It would break him. He dropped his phone on the table and leaned against the counter, feeling like he was about to break. For the first time in months, Jason felt utterly lost. He had no idea what to do next. The world seemed dark, and the path ahead was unclear. His writing career wasn't taking off. His relationships with his family were strained, and he couldn't even find joy in the one thing that had once made him feel alive. It was in this moment of desperation that Jason realized something. He had been trying to do everything on his own. He had been carrying the weight of his dreams, his guilt, and his family's expectations all by himself. And it was too much. Maybe it was time to ask for help. It wasn't a thought that came easily to him. Jason had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on not needing anyone else's approval. But the truth was, he couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't keep pretending that he had all the answers. So, for the first time in a long time, he did something he never thought he'd do. He called his mother. His hands were trembling as the phone rang. He had no idea what he was going to say, no idea how she would react. But he had to try. He couldn't keep running from the reality of their relationship, from the weight of her disappointment. When his mother picked up, Jason could hear the relief in her voice. "Jason, is everything okay? You haven't answered any of my calls." He took a deep breath. "Mom, I need to talk to you. I don't know if I've been clear enough about this, but I need you to understand that this is my choice, my life. And I can't keep pretending to be someone I'm not." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jason could hear her breathing softly, and for a moment, he thought she might say something harsh, something that would break him. But then finally she spoke. "I know, Jason," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "I know you're struggling. And I'm sorry if I've pushed you too hard. I want you to be happy. I don't want you to feel like you have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders alone. You don't have to do this by yourself." Jason's throat tightened, the weight of her words hitting him harder than he expected. "I know. I guess I've just been so afraid of failing, of letting everyone down. I didn't know how to ask for help." "You don't have to be perfect, Jason," his mother said gently. "You just have to be yourself. We may not always agree with the choices you make, but we love you. And we want you to find your way, whatever that looks like." The tears came then, tears that Jason hadn't realized he was holding back. He felt an overwhelming rush of relief, a flood of emotions he had been suppressing for so long. He wasn't alone. And that realization, that small bit of understanding, made all the difference. Jason woke up the next morning with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in months. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long, the burden of expectations, guilt, and the relentless pursuit of approval, was still there, but it no longer felt like it was suffocating him. It was as if a crack had opened in the wall of resistance he had built around himself, and a little bit of light had slipped through. After his conversation with his mother the night before, Jason had felt a shift within himself. It wasn't as though all the pressure had disappeared, but for the first time in ages, he felt heard. His mother's voice, gentle and understanding, had broken through the walls he had put up to protect himself from their judgment. It wasn't an immediate fix, but it was a start, and sometimes starting was all you needed. He spent the morning working on his writing, his mind more focused than it had been in weeks. There was a clarity now, a renewed sense of purpose. Jason knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would still be obstacles to face, but he also knew that he couldn't let fear and self-doubt dictate his life anymore. His journey, though uncertain, was his own to take. By the time he sat down to lunch, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Jessica. "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation. I'm sorry if I made you feel like I didn't support you. I just didn't understand. But I do now. I can't say I fully get it, but I respect your decision. I'll always be here for you." Jason's eyes stung as he read the message. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words until they appeared on the screen. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was progress. And it meant more to him than he could express. His phone rang a few minutes later. It was his father. "Jason," his father said, his voice gruff but sincere. "I've been thinking about our conversation too. I don't always understand your choices, but I do understand that you're trying to figure things out. I'm not going to keep pushing you. Just take care of yourself, son." Jason nodded, even though his father couldn't see him. "Thanks, Dad. I appreciate it." There was a long pause, and then his father added, "I may not agree with everything you're doing, but you've always been smart. You'll figure it out." The conversation ended there, but the weight of his father's words lingered. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt like there was a chance for real healing in his family. It wouldn't happen overnight, but the shift was undeniable. They were starting to see him, not as the person they wanted him to be, but as the person he had become. That afternoon, Jason decided to take a walk to clear his head. The sun was shining and the air was crisp. Everything seemed to be in harmony, like the world was offering him a brief moment of peace. As he walked through the quiet streets, he thought about how far he had come. A year ago, he would have never imagined being in this place, standing on the edge of something new, with a sense of freedom that had once seemed impossible. He thought about his writing, about the stories he wanted to tell. And as he thought about the future, something clicked inside him. This wasn't just about escaping his family's expectations. It was about finding his own voice, his own purpose. Writing wasn't just a way to rebel, it was the way he could contribute to the world, the way he could make sense of his experiences and share them with others. Jason didn't know if he would ever be a best-selling author, or if his stories would change the world. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he was finally doing something for himself, something that made him feel alive. And that was enough. That evening, after a quiet dinner, Jason sat down at his desk, ready to write. The words came more easily now. The block that had kept him from writing for so long had finally broken, and he found himself lost in the story he was creating. It was like the floodgates had opened, and everything he had been holding inside, his fears, his frustrations, his hopes, poured out onto the page. His phone buzzed again, but this time he didn't pick it up. Instead, he focused on the words in front of him, letting himself get lost in the world he was building. For the first time in a long time, Jason didn't feel the need to explain himself, to justify his choices. He just needed to create, to exist in this space that was entirely his own. As the night wore on, he found himself thinking about his family again, but this time it wasn't with the same weight of guilt and frustration. He thought about the love that had always been there, buried beneath the misunderstandings and the pressure. He thought about how they were starting to understand him, how the cracks in their relationship were beginning to heal. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Jason realized something important that night. The journey to healing wasn't linear. It wasn't about making one decision and expecting everything to fall into place. It was about the small steps, the phone calls, the conversations, the moments of understanding, that eventually added up to something bigger. It was about learning to accept himself, flaws and all, and letting go of the need to be perfect. And for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Jason woke up the next morning with a quiet confidence he hadn't felt in a long time. The world outside his window looked brighter, more promising. He had always believed that change came suddenly, with a big, dramatic event, but now he realized it wasn't like that at all. Change was slow, incremental, like the steady growth of a tree from a seed. His life was starting to feel like that tree, with deep roots forming where there had once been uncertainty. He had spent the last few weeks focusing on his writing more than ever. He found himself waking up early, writing for hours before his shifts at the hospital. The characters he created were becoming more vivid, more real, and their stories, his stories, began to flow in ways they hadn't before. The creative block that had held him captive for so long had lifted, and he was finally able to embrace the process. At work, his colleagues noticed the change too. Jason wasn't the same distracted, quiet version of himself he had been. He was still the compassionate nurse he had always been, but there was a new energy about him. He had regained the spark that had once drawn people to him. One morning, as he was preparing to leave for work, he received a message from his mother. "We're proud of you, Jason. We know this hasn't been easy, but you're doing what's right for you. Keep going." The message was simple, but it meant more to him than he could have ever expected. It wasn't just about the words themselves. It was about what they represented. His mother, who had once been so desperate for him to return to his old life, was finally accepting his choices. She wasn't just tolerating them anymore, she was supporting them. Jason sat down at his desk, the message still lingering in his mind. He thought back to the conversations they had shared, the long arguments, the misunderstandings, the harsh words. And yet, here they were now, sharing a quiet moment of understanding. His relationship with his family wasn't perfect, and it wasn't fixed overnight, but it was changing. The healing was happening in small, quiet moments, and Jason was starting to feel like he could breathe again. It wasn't just his family that was noticing the change in him. His writing was slowly starting to gain traction. He had joined a few online writing communities, sharing his work, receiving feedback, and gradually building a following. One of his short stories even made its way to a small publisher who had expressed interest in a full manuscript. It wasn't a big deal yet, but for Jason it was validation. It was proof that the path he had chosen wasn't just a pipe dream. He was moving forward one step at a time. The struggle wasn't over. Jason knew that. There were still moments of doubt, still days when the weight of his choices felt like too much to bear. There would always be the nagging voices. His father's rationality, his mother's worry, Jessica's concerns, that told him he was making a mistake. But Jason had learned something important. It wasn't their approval he needed to feel fulfilled. It was his own. One evening, after a long shift at the hospital, Jason found himself sitting in a small cafe, a notebook open in front of him. He wasn't writing for anyone else. He wasn't trying to please anyone. He was writing for himself, capturing the thoughts, the feelings, the experiences that had shaped him over the last year. As he wrote, he found himself reflecting on the road that had brought him here. It wasn't just the writing that had changed him. It was everything. His relationship with his family had shifted. He had stopped seeking their approval and started seeking his own peace. His career as a nurse, while still a part of him, had become just that, a part. He no longer felt trapped by it, nor by anyone's expectations. He had found the courage to live his life on his own terms. As Jason wrote, he remembered his first steps into the unknown. He remembered how terrifying it had felt to walk away from everything he knew. But now, he realized that fear had been a necessary part of the journey. It had been the catalyst for his growth, pushing him to find strength he never knew he had. The words on the page flowed easily now. His hand moved quickly, capturing his thoughts before they could escape. The story he was telling wasn't just fiction. It was his own story, a reflection of the person he had become. As he finished the final sentence, Jason sat back, staring at the page. He had done it. He had taken the leap, and although the road was still long, it felt less uncertain now. He wasn't where he wanted to be yet, but he was closer. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Jessica. "I've been thinking about you. I know it hasn't been easy for either of us, but I'm proud of you. And I just wanted to say, I love you, Jason." Jason smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. He texted back a simple reply. "I love you too, Jess. Thanks for understanding." It wasn't a perfect ending. The road ahead would still have its bumps, its twists and turns. There would be moments of doubt, moments when Jason would question whether he was doing the right thing. But as he looked at the story in front of him, at the person he had become, he knew that no matter what came next, he was ready. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't living for anyone else. He was living for himself. Jason stood in front of the window, watching the city below as the sun began to set. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, and for the first time in a long time he felt at peace. The weight he had been carrying for so long had lightened. There was no immediate pressure anymore. No loud voices telling him what to do. No overwhelming expectations hanging over his head. It was just him, standing at the edge of something new. The journey had been long, filled with self-doubt, fear, and moments of despair, but it had also been a journey of growth, discovery, and healing. Jason had found a sense of purpose, not just in his writing, but in his own life. He had learned to embrace who he truly was, despite the obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his mother. "I just wanted to say that I'm proud of you. I know I've said it before, but you've really found your path. I can't wait to see where this takes you. Remember, we love you no matter what." Jason smiled as he read the message. It wasn't just the words themselves that mattered. It was the change in tone, the shift in understanding that had taken place between them. His mother's pride no longer came from seeing him follow the life she had planned for him. It came from seeing him embrace his own choices. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was all he needed. He texted back, "Thanks, Mom. I love you too." He put his phone down and returned to the window, the quiet calm settling over him again. The noise of the city, the lives of those around him, seemed distant now. He wasn't consumed by it. For the first time in his life, Jason felt like he was standing in his own space, no longer living according to someone else's script, but writing his own story. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence in his apartment. Jason hesitated for a moment, then walked over to answer it. When he opened the door, he was met with the sight of Jessica standing there, a small smile on her face. "Hey," she said softly. "I figured you might need some company." Jason smiled, his heart warming at the sight of her. "I could use that," he said, stepping aside to let her in. She entered and they made their way to the couch, sitting down side by side. The air between them was easy, the weight of the past lifted. There were no more strained silences, no more unspoken resentments. They had both grown, both healed. And now they were just two people finding their way forward together. "I'm proud of you, Jason," Jessica said quietly, looking at him with a sincerity that made his chest swell. "For everything you've done. For everything you're doing." Jason glanced at her, his eyes full of gratitude. "Thanks, Jess. Means a lot to hear that from you. I don't think I would have made it this far without you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the bond between them stronger than it had ever been. Jason realized that, in many ways, this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations, but by his own choices. The next day, Jason received an email from the small publisher who had shown interest in his writing. They wanted to move forward with his manuscript, offering him a contract. It wasn't the breakthrough moment that would catapult him into fame, but it was a huge step. A validation of his hard work, his dedication. A sign that perhaps he was on the right path after all. He sat back in his chair, rereading the email a few times, trying to process what it meant. It wasn't just a win for his writing career. It was a symbol of everything he had overcome. Of all the doubts, the family pressures, the internal struggles. He had come out on the other side, stronger and more sure of who he was. Later that week, Jason attended a writing event with a group of fellow writers he had met online. It was a small gathering, a chance to meet people who shared his passion, and as he mingled with them, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in a long time. He wasn't just an outsider looking in. He was part of this world, a world that valued his creativity and his voice. As he left the event that evening, he felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't known he needed. He had found his place. It wasn't in the life his parents had imagined for him, nor in the easy path he had once thought he should take. It was in his own story, his own journey. The road ahead would still have its challenges. There would be moments when Jason would question himself, moments when the weight of expectations would try to creep back in. But now, he knew he was strong enough to face it all. He had found his voice, and nothing could take that away from him. He had learned that life wasn't about seeking perfection or approval. It was about embracing who you were, accepting the messiness, the uncertainty, and finding peace with it. It was about choosing yourself, even when it felt difficult, even when it meant disappointing others. And most importantly, it was about knowing that the road forward was his to walk.